When I first applied for the job at the funeral home, I never imagined it would be the beginning of a nightmare. The job seemed simple enough, assisting with arrangements, preparing bodies, and keeping the place in order. Little did I know there were rules that came with this job, rules that, if broken, could lead to consequences far worse than any horror story you've ever heard. I didn't understand then, but I do now. And trust me, you don't want to make the same mistakes I did. I remember the first day like it was yesterday. It was cold. The kind of cold that made the air bite at your skin, and the gray sky pressed down like a heavy blanket. I was excited though. I had been desperate for work, and a funeral home seemed like a safe, stable option. Plus, the pay was decent. The director of the funeral home, Mr. Harper, greeted me at the front door. He was tall, with slicked-back gray hair and sharp features. His eyes were cold, almost like he had seen too much. He gave me a firm handshake and led me inside. The place smelled like antiseptic, but there was something else, something faintly metallic like the scent of old copper. As we walked through the long hallways, Mr. Harper explained the job's basic duties. You'll be assisting with the bodies, helping families with arrangements, and making sure everything runs smoothly, he said. His voice was deep, authoritative, yet strangely distant, as if he wasn't fully present in the moment. I nodded, trying not to sound too eager. He showed me to the back room where the embalming tables were. A large walk-in fridge sat in the corner, cold air leaking out as the door opened. The room was stark, sterile, and, for lack of a better word, clinical. The hardest part of this job, Mr. Harper said, is following the rules. Some rules you'll learn quickly, others take time. His voice faltered for a moment, and I caught the briefest flicker of something in his eyes. Was it fear? No, I must have imagined it. He quickly composed himself and handed me a clipboard with a checklist of my duties. First rule: you never ever disturb the dead after hours, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. No matter what. Do you understand? I chuckled nervously, thinking he was just being overly cautious. Of course I understand. He gave me a nod, though his expression was hard to read. Good. Now let's get you started. The first few days were uneventful, just the usual tasks: preparing bodies, helping arrange flowers, and dealing with grieving families. It was somber work, but nothing too alarming. However, everything changed on my first night shift. I had been asked to stay late to help with a body that was scheduled for a midnight viewing. The deceased was an older man, Mr. Collins, who had passed unexpectedly in his sleep. His family wanted to see him one last time before the service the next day. I followed the checklist as Mr. Harper had instructed, and everything seemed fine at first. But then, as I was alone in the back room, I heard it. Faint sound like whispering. I froze, unsure if it was just the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. The whispering grew louder, coming from the walk-in fridge. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. I told myself it was nothing, that I had just been working too long. But then the door to the fridge opened by itself. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly approached the fridge. My hand trembled as I reached for the door. Inside, the body of Mr. Collins lay in the exact position I had left him, except his eyes were open. They stared at me, unblinking, almost accusingly. My stomach churned as I backed away, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just seen. Was it possible that someone had tampered with the body? Or was I just imagining things, driven by exhaustion? I turned to leave, but just as I did, I heard a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. My blood ran cold as I whipped around to find the source of the sound. The fridge door slammed shut, and the growl turned into a soft, almost mocking chuckle. I rushed out of the room and straight to Mr. Harper's office. But when I told him what had happened, he didn't seem surprised. That's the second rule, he said calmly. You never ignore the dead when they call to you. I stared at him, confused. What do you mean? Mr. Collins, his eyes. Mr. Harper held up his hand, silencing me. You'll learn in time. There's a reason we follow these rules. Things are not always as they seem. The following days were filled with strange occurrences. The dead, or rather the bodies I prepared, seemed different. Their eyes would move or their fingers twitched, like they were trying to communicate something. Mr. Harper was distant, rarely speaking to me outside of work-related matters. The other staff, 2 embalming technicians and a receptionist, were equally silent, as if they were afraid of something. One night, while I was working late on another body, I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. It wasn't the first time I had seen this shadow. Every night it would appear, always just out of reach, lingering at the edges of my vision. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than the flickering lights or my own growing paranoia. But then one night I saw it clearly. A tall, gaunt figure standing in the doorway, watching me. I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, staring with hollow eyes. I took a step forward, but as I did, it vanished. That night I went to Mr. Harper again. This time I couldn't hide the panic in my voice. "The rules," he said, almost as if he were talking to himself. "You're not supposed to interact with them. Not until they come for you. But it seems it's already too late for that." It had been 2 weeks since I started at the funeral home, and I was beginning to realize that I had made a grave mistake. Every rule had a reason, but I had broken them one by one. And now, the consequences were beginning to unfold. One night, I was cleaning up in the embalming room when I heard the door creak open behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. I felt it, a cold, suffocating presence. Slowly I turned, and there it was again, the gaunt figure standing in the doorway. This time I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped me. The figure took a step forward, and I heard its voice, low, guttural, and filled with malice. "You ignored the rules," it said. "And now you'll pay the price." Suddenly, everything around me seemed to warp and twist. The walls closed in. The air grew thick with an oppressive force. The lights flickered wildly, casting strange shadows that danced like living things. The figure moved closer, its features becoming clearer. It wasn't human. Its skin was stretched thin over its bones, and its eyes were hollow voids. Its mouth split open unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Before I could scream, the world went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the embalming table, my body stiff and cold. The funeral home was eerily silent. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't obey. Panic set in as I realized what had happened. I had become one of them. The last rule Mr. Harper had told me still echoed in my mind. You never, ever disturb the dead after hours. I had broken that rule. And now, I was part of the collection. Just another body waiting to be called by something far worse than death. And the worst part, I could still hear the whispers, coming from the other bodies in the room. The ones that were waiting for their turn to be disturbed. The dead were calling to me now.